So the president or the governor are the executors of, or sorry, they execute the budget that's passed by the legislature. And Congress or the legislature want to make sure that the president does exactly what the budget says. But the president also wants to be able to manage the executive branch and help steer them in the way that he wants. So they passed a law in 1971 called the Impoundment Control Act. Impoundment is when you don't spend the money that Congress tells you to spend. President Nixon was doing this over and over and over again. They passed this law. So there's a question in the law: can a president slow down money in order to spend money on things that are more important? Because the money doesn't come in all at once. It's not like, hey, here's $4 trillion. It's like, hey, here's some money. It's going to come in over time. So can the president direct money to things that they want to get done first and slow down some of the spending that doesn't need to happen right away? So a deferral means that you're going to temporarily spend money and temporarily not spend money on something, generally to spend money on something else. A rescission is when that doesn't happen at all. So in other words, they spend no money on the thing that Congress told them to spend money on. Now, this is the crux of the impeachment of President Trump. Like I was talking about earlier on in the video, President Trump wanted, at least apparently, and I don't know, we don't know the motivation, but we do know what actually happened, that money didn't get spent the way Congress had told him to spend the money. And whether or not that's because, there was some favor in exchange, whatever, it doesn't really matter. There's a question about whether or not the refusal to spend money within an appropriate amount of time violated the Impoundment Control Act of 1971, which the Congressional Budget Office said, yes, it did. And that was very, very clear he violated the law. Now, the impeachment happens later because of, why he did that. Now, was the money actually spent? Yes. But according to the law, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you can temporarily do it with the advice of Congress. You can tell them for a certain period of time, but you can't just not spend the money. Why is that important? Well, because the speed at which money flows into an agency determines in large part whether or not that agency can do their job well. If you have 365 days in a year, on the 345th day of the year, you get your entire budget, but you've been starved the entire time. You get your money that last 15 days, last 20 days, you really cannot spend that money effectively. Even if all the money showed up on time, or showed up, but it wasn't on time, you've starved the agency, and then at the end of those 365 days, the budget year ends, the fiscal year ends, you can't spend the money anyway. So how we control the flow of money is one way that the president can encourage agencies to behave well, or hurt agencies that aren't behaving well or according to their preferences. But Congress has real strict rules about doing that because it's Congress's authority to provide money to the agencies. Now, managers, presidents, want to ensure that their preferred agencies, do their job well. How do they do that? They speed up money going to certain agencies and they slow down money to other agencies. If we follow where the money's going, we can see who's doing what and where, and the executive can control the direction and pace of government activity by controlling how fast money goes. That's why it's crucial to have the Office of Management Budget and the Executive Office of the President, because in the OMB, the president can direct the flows of money. That's his whole job, and money is something that agencies really respond to. So, budgets are just not like, hey, here's some money. We use budgets. Both agencies play these games with Congress about how much money should be allocated to them. Congress plays games with the agencies about threats and control and authorizations and appropriations. And then, the president also plays games with the budget, both to undo some congressional priorities, but also to do some of their own priorities as well. So budgets are really, really crucial to how agencies work. Now, okay, switching away from the federal government just to some special conditions for state and local governments. State and local governments mostly have to have balanced budgets. They can't print their money. They can't engage in long-term borrowing like the federal government can. Now, that's not 100% true. States can issue bonds, which is debt, and they can agree to that, but most of the time that has to go through voters. And in California, that debt has to be specific to a purpose. So they can't just sort of say, hey, we want a deficit spend for some period of time. Why don't you vote on it? They actually have to get approval from the voters for specific projects. Most state and local governments have two distinct budgets. They have a capital budget and they have an operational budget. When we went through a fiscal crisis about a decade or more ago here at Cal State Fullerton, the capital budget got stolen from in order to pay for operational expenses, and so we deferred maintenance, and we did some other things like not repairing elevators and not painting buildings and not spending as much on some of those physical facility stuff. We borrowed it to pay for copies and administrative assistance and the other stuff that where the budget was cut. Now, interestingly, if a state and local government does not pass a budget, that whole government shuts down. California was a professional legislature all throughout up until like the 70s. We passed some laws that increased created term limits. Our legislature started to fall apart. We have a weak party system. There's some other things that are going on, and for years and years and years, the beginning of the fiscal year would start and we still wouldn't have a budget. And so we'd go through these weirdo shutdowns and continuing resolutions and some other stuff like that, and then we'd have a budget like 2 months later. And then a couple of years back, the citizens passed a proposition that said, if we don't get our budget on time, then the lawmakers in California don't get paid. And guess what? On-time budgets. It's just like that. We can do that now. So state and local governments have sort of different operating issues that the federal government doesn't have to deal with. Because they have to balance their budgets, they have to do a really good job at forecasting taxation revenues and economic growth and a whole bunch of other that stuff, because they can't really spend more than they have. It also leads to state and local governments having rainy day funds and slush funds that are surplus that could be used better by not sitting around, but they sit around because they can't because they have to balance their budgets. So some weird constraints in state and local government. Now, budgeting is the area that most fundamentally shapes policy decision making. And if we don't allocate funding to a program, that program essentially dies. At the same time, how we control the flow of money in budgets can really help agencies or really hinder agencies. And interestingly, if we formalize a budget at one level, it could be reformulated later because of budgetary concerns. We might have mid-year economic problems. Presidents, elected officials might, move budgets around and around. So budgeting is actually a really core concept in public administration. And it's one that causes a lot of frustration, but it's really core to helping us understand how government agencies work.